The ballroom was a sea of glittering silk and whispered secrets. Guests mingled, their laughter echoing off the grand walls of the Ashford estate. But for Victoria Ashford, it was as though the world had paused. She stood near the edge of the room, unnoticed, as always. The golden chandeliers above cast a warm glow, but the light never reached her. The whispers that danced around her were full of mockery, dismissing her as insignificant. No one saw her, not truly. No one cared. Until Duke Alexander Darnley walked in. His presence cut through the room like a blade, silencing the chatter. His tall frame, draped in dark velvet, commanded the attention of every eye in the room. A murmur of awe rippled through the crowd as he moved, each step calculated, powerful. He was a man whose very name could bring a kingdom to its knees, whose word could shatter lives. And yet, there he was, standing amidst the sea of nobility, not looking at the beautiful women paraded before him, but at her. His gaze met hers from across the room, and the world seemed to tilt. Her heart stopped, 1,000 emotions flooding her chest all at once: surprise, fear, and something else she couldn't name. The room held its breath. She was nothing compared to the other women here. Charlotte her sister, the true jewel of the Ashford family, was the one they all admired, the one who would surely capture the Duke's attention. But instead, his eyes locked onto her. "Give me the one they call useless," Duke Darnley's voice cut through the air. The words were quiet, yet they carried a weight that seemed to freeze the entire ballroom. The air thickened. Time seemed to slow as his eyes never left her. Victoria, the woman who had been discarded, overlooked, dismissed as nothing more than a shadow, was now the center of it all. She felt her pulse race as she stood frozen in place, her breath caught in her throat. There was no way he meant her. This had to be a mistake. She had never been more aware of the rustle of her simple gown, of the ink stain on her finger, of her hair, hastily pinned and askew. She was not one of the perfect, polished women that filled the ballroom, not the one who could dazzle him with a glance or charm him with a smile. But still, Duke Darnley moved toward her. Each step he took toward her was a march that seemed to pull the room into the vortex of his power. As he approached, the whispers of the crowd quieted, replaced by the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. When he reached her, the room seemed to disappear. All that existed was him, standing before her with his cold, calculating gaze. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her, as though measuring her every inch, as though deciding whether she was worthy of the decision he was about to make. "You," he said finally, his voice calm, his tone sharp as a knife. She didn't move, not even when his hand reached out to her. The touch was light, but it carried a weight that she could feel deep in her bones. He gripped her wrist with a power that was undeniable, pulling her towards him. Every eye in the room was now on them, but she couldn't look away from his piercing gaze. In that moment, she felt every ounce of her life's injustice, her years of being invisible, of being ignored, burn away. "Come with me," he said, and though his voice was low, it held the finality of a command. Victoria wanted to resist. She wanted to pull away, to shout, to demand an explanation. But in that moment, when the Duke's hand was the only thing anchoring her to the ground, she couldn't move. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. And with a single movement, he led her through the sea of astonished faces, his hand still firmly gripping hers. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and for the first time in her life, Victoria Ashford was not ignored. She was seen, and her world was never going to be the same again. Victoria could hardly breathe. Duke Darnley's grip on her wrist was unyielding, yet it wasn't the force of his hand that held her in place. It was the weight of his gaze. Every step they took together was an act of defiance against the room's unspoken expectations. The nobles around them parted as though the ground beneath them had shifted, leaving a trail of murmurs that reverberated like thunder. He didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the confusion swirling. In the air, his attention was singular, focused entirely on her. She could feel the eyes of every guest boring into her, but it was Duke Darnley's presence that commanded her every thought, every instinct. They reached the center of the ballroom. The musicians had paused, their instruments silent as if they too understood that something irreversible was unfolding. The Duke stood still, holding her in place, their bodies so close that Victoria could feel the heat of his presence radiating from him. His hand was still on her wrist, yet he made no further move. The world seemed to slow down. The laughter, the whispers, the shifting feet. Everything became background noise to the tension hanging between them. She wanted to pull away, but her body didn't move. There was no space left between them. She felt the sharpness of his breath, the quiet steadiness of his pulse. She was completely aware of the contrast between them. He, a man of power and control, and she, a woman deemed invisible by those who thought themselves above her. He had taken her from the shadows and thrust her into a place she could hardly comprehend. She wasn't sure if she wanted to run or stay, but the decision was out of her hands. His voice finally broke the silence. "Do not be afraid," he said, his words so calm that they felt like a promise wrapped in a command. His gaze held hers, his lips not moving from the steely resolve they held. She knew he wasn't speaking of the crowd or the opulence that surrounded them. He was speaking of her. "You have nothing to fear." Victoria swallowed, her throat tight with the strangest mixture of fear and something else. A flicker of defiance, maybe. It was impossible to know for sure. The room remained eerily still, as if waiting for her to react. She tried to steady herself, to gather the courage to speak, but the words got caught in her chest. She could only look at him, this man who held her in the palm of his hand, yet somehow, it was as if she was the one holding him in her gaze. The Duke took another step closer, closing the space between them until she could feel the weight of his presence without him even touching her. The heat from his body seemed to sear through the space that had previously felt so suffocating. "I choose you," he said, the words cutting through the tension like a blade through velvet. "Not because you are perfect, but because you are not what they expect." His voice was low, almost intimate, and it sent a chill through her veins. She couldn't understand it. How he could choose her, the one who had always been dismissed, the one who had never been considered worthy. His hand, still resting lightly on her wrist, was the only thing grounding her in this moment. She wanted to speak, to ask him what this meant, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt the weight of the room's gaze shift from her to him, as if she was no longer the center of attention. He was. The whispers started again, louder now, though still cautious, and Victoria could feel them slithering around her like tendrils. "The Duke has chosen her," she heard someone murmur. Another voice whispered, "But why?" And yet, the Duke said nothing more. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. He simply stood there, as the room swirled with a mixture of confusion, admiration, and something darker, envy. They were waiting for her to respond, to give some sort of indication that she belonged here, that she could withstand the weight of this choice. But she wasn't sure she was ready. She wasn't sure what to do with this sudden power, this unexpected place in his world. The hand that had once been an anchor now felt like a chain, pulling her closer to him, to a life she hadn't been prepared for. She tried to steady her breath, tried to remember who she was before all of this, the invisible woman, the forgotten noble woman. But those pieces of herself seemed so far away now, lost in the face of his gaze. "Do you accept?" The words were so simple, yet they hung in the air, charged with the weight of the world. Victoria didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until the moment became unbearable. Finally, she nodded, the smallest gesture, but it was enough. Duke Darnley's lips twitched ever so slightly, as if he had been waiting for that answer all along. He didn't smile, didn't show any emotion, but the shift in the room was undeniable. The nobles who had once turned their noses up at her now watched with bated breath, the room alive with new energy. The game had changed, and now, Victoria was at the center of it. Victoria's pulse raced as she stood before the Duke, the weight of his gaze more suffocating than any physical restraint. She could feel his presence like a tangible force, pulling her closer to him, yet keeping her at arm's length. The ballroom, once filled with music and laughter, was now silent, the air thick with the tension between them. She could hear the faint rustling of silk as the nobles around them shifted uneasily, unsure of what was happening, but unable to tear their eyes away. Duke Darnley didn't move. His hand remained lightly clasped around her wrist, but there was no warmth in the touch. It was firm, cold, like a binding contract. Every part of her wanted to pull away, to break free of the intensity that wrapped itself around her, but she couldn't. The power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer the unnoticed woman standing at the edge of the room. She was the center of it all. The Duke's dark eyes, filled with something unreadable, locked onto hers. He didn't speak at first, but his presence commanded more than words ever could. "You are no longer invisible," he said, his voice quiet, but cutting through the tension like a blade. "You are mine to shape." The words echoed in her mind, a declaration she couldn't quite comprehend. Mine to shape. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. She had been dismissed, disregarded, left in the shadows for so long. Now, the Duke was claiming her, and the weight of that claim felt heavier than any judgment she had ever faced. She could feel the room's eyes on her, their gazes now filled with curiosity, confusion, and a hint of envy. The air crackled with the electricity of her sudden transformation, but Victoria couldn't escape the feeling that she was on the verge of something far bigger than herself. The Duke took a step forward, bringing them closer, the proximity almost overwhelming. His hand shifted, now holding her arm, guiding her through the sea of stunned faces. He didn't look at anyone else. His focus remained solely on her. It was as if the rest of the room had disappeared, leaving only the two of them standing in the heart of the storm. "Move," he commanded, his voice low, almost a growl. With his words, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, the whispers growing louder with every step they took. Victoria could feel the power of the moment settling in. This was her choice, her moment to decide what she would become. The Duke's hand was like an anchor, tethering her to him, but it was her own decision to move forward. She could turn away, reject him, and return to the life she knew, the life of insignificance, of being a shadow in the corners of grand ballrooms. But something deep inside her resisted that path. She had been a pawn for so long, dismissed, forgotten, but now she had the chance to choose something else. They reached the center of the room, and the Duke's hand released her arm, but his presence didn't. It loomed over her like a shadow, unyielding and powerful. He stepped back, his gaze never leaving her face, watching her every reaction. "This is where you belong," he said, his words like a decree. She stood there, at the heart of the ballroom, the center of attention, and for the first time, she wasn't invisible. Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of the moment settled over her. She had been chosen, but what did that mean? Was she meant to be a puppet in the Duke's game? Or would she take the power he had given her and use it for herself? Her thoughts swirled in a storm of confusion and excitement, but one thing was clear. Her life would never be the same. The crowd watched, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. The tension in the air was palpable. The Duke's next move would seal her fate, but what would she do? She felt her breath catch in her throat as the room held its collective breath, waiting for her decision. Her eyes met his once more, and she saw something flicker in his gaze. Expectation, but also something deeper, something darker. "Now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. "Now we begin." The words hung in the air. Like a challenge, a call to action. It was up to her to decide whether to accept it or to reject it, to walk away or to step into the life he had planned for her. And for the first time, she wasn't sure what to choose. But there was no turning back now. The Duke had given her a choice, and the world was watching to see which path she would take. The tension was unbearable, thick and suffocating, as the two of them stood on the precipice of something much larger than either of them could have imagined. The room was still, waiting for the moment to unfold, for the power to shift, for the game to truly begin. The room held its breath as Duke Darnley's gaze never wavered from Victoria. She stood there, trembling, the weight of the entire ballroom pressing down on her, yet the Duke's presence anchored her in a way she couldn't explain. The noble women, once the center of attention, now shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flickering between the Duke and Victoria. The murmurs, once loud and frequent, now died down to cautious whispers. The power in the room had shifted, but it wasn't just Victoria who felt it, it was everyone. Duke Darnley's hand remained firmly at her back, guiding her through the throngs of disapproving stares. With every step, the crowd parted, a path carved by the sheer force of his will. But it wasn't just his power that they feared, it was the uncertainty of what came next. The tension in the room thickened, suffocating the space between them. Every pair of eyes followed them as they moved toward the front of the ballroom, where the heart of the social hierarchy stood. Victoria felt the weight of every gaze like a physical burden, but there was no turning back now. The Duke's influence had already claimed her place. She had become the center of a storm she couldn't yet control. But as she walked, she realized something else. She was no longer invisible. His hand, still at her back, was like a tether, pulling her into a world she had only ever observed from the shadows. She could feel her heart beating faster, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The grand hall seemed to stretch endlessly before them, but it was the Duke who commanded the space, who demanded silence and respect with every step. As they reached the front of the room, the noble's eyes followed, some filled with disdain, others with curiosity, but all of them aware of the power that had just shifted. Duke Darnley's hand finally left her back, and for a moment, everything stopped. The air was thick with anticipation. He turned to face her, his dark eyes locking with hers. There was no smile, no reassurance, only the quiet force of his presence. "You are no longer a shadow," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You belong here, among them." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a declaration. She had been seen, chosen, and the consequences of that choice were yet to unfold. The ballroom was still, the grand chandeliers casting a soft glow over the scene. The Duke's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the world outside the ballroom ceased to exist. It was just them, locked in a silent battle for control, for place, for power. She could feel it, the shift in the room's energy. The nobles, once so certain of their positions, now faltered. They had never expected this. A woman, a mere shadow among them, now stood at the heart of their world, a world that had always kept her on the outside. The whispers began again, but this time, they weren't directed at her, they were directed at the Duke. Some were skeptical, some were intrigued, and others, she could feel, were afraid. The Duke had made his choice, and it had rippled through the room like a wave crashing on the shore. Victoria stood there, caught in the eye of the storm. The power that had once been so distant now surged through her veins, threatening to consume her. She didn't know how to navigate it, didn't know how to wield it. But one thing was certain, she would never be the same again. Duke Darnley took a step closer, closing the distance between them. His presence was overwhelming, his control absolute. He didn't need to touch her, his very being seemed to command the space. "They will never look at you the same way again," he said, his words soft but laden with meaning. "You have been marked." Victoria felt a shiver run down her spine. He was right. The moment she had been chosen, the moment he had looked at her, everything had changed. She was no longer the woman who stood quietly in the background. She was no longer the one who could be overlooked. She had been thrust into a world of power and influence, and she didn't know if she was ready. But there was no going back. The Duke's words, his gaze, everything about him made it clear that she had been claimed. She was his now, and the room knew it. As the silence stretched between them, Victoria's mind raced. The choice had been made for her, but what would she do with it? Would she accept her place by his side, or would she fight for control over her own fate? The ball had barely begun, but already the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. The Duke had changed everything, and now it was up to her to decide how to play the game. The room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken words and the weight of society's gaze. Duke Darnley stood at the center, the undeniable force that pulled every eye toward him. His gaze never left Victoria, who now stood beside him, the center of a storm she couldn't escape. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, resonated with power, and for the first time, she realized just how dangerous it could be to be near him. She had been chosen, yes, but at what cost? Her heart raced, but it wasn't fear that gripped her. It was the strange, intoxicating pull of his presence. She felt the tension building between them, thick and unrelenting, like a string stretched taut, ready to snap. The ballroom around them had become a battleground, the glittering nobles watching closely, waiting for the next move. Victoria felt it, her transformation, the shift from invisible to seen. The eyes of the room were no longer indifferent. Now, they were filled with curiosity, envy, and skepticism. She had been thrust into this world, and she was no longer sure how to navigate it. She wasn't sure she even wanted to. As Duke Darnley turned to face her, his presence seemed to swell, overwhelming everything else. His hand was still resting lightly on her arm, a simple gesture, but it felt like a chain, binding her to him. "You belong here," he said, his voice low, steady, and firm, the kind of voice that demanded obedience. It wasn't a question. It was a command. Victoria wanted to protest, to reject him, to push away from this power, but the words died in her throat. She couldn't escape the fact that, for the first time in her life, she had a place beside him. She had been marked. She was now part of his world, and the consequences of that would be felt, even if she wasn't ready for them. The whispers around them grew louder, but Darnley remained impervious to them. He didn't need to react. His mere presence had already silenced the room. As they walked together through the ballroom, she could feel every eye on her, judging, questioning, wondering how long she would last by his side. The women, once the epitome of grace and beauty, now looked at her with a mixture of disdain and disbelief. And the men, she could see the calculating looks they exchanged, measuring her, wondering how long it would take for her to crack under the pressure. But the Duke remained a constant at her side, his hand never leaving her arm, his gaze never straying. Every step they took was a reminder of the power he held and the price she would have to pay to stay in this world. The power dynamic was shifting, and Victoria felt the weight of it with each step. She had been nothing, a shadow in the corner of the room, and now she was at the Duke's side, a woman marked by his choosing. She could feel the eyes of the court on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. But Duke Darnley didn't seem to care. He didn't need to. He had already made his move, and it was up to her to keep up. The silence between them grew, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence filled with power, with something that neither of them could escape. The Duke's hand tightened slightly on her arm, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind her that he had control. They reached the center of the room, and the moment felt suspended in time. The grand chandeliers above them flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. The musicians had paused, and for a moment, the entire room felt as though it had been frozen in time. Everything around them was still, but inside Victoria, everything was moving, racing, spinning. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt the eyes of the nobles on her, their judgment and expectations swirling around her. But there was no escape. The Duke was still at her side, still in control, still the force that held everything together. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice low, but his words felt like a promise and a threat all at once. "You are mine now." Victoria looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't know how to feel about that. She had been chosen, but what did that mean for her? What did it mean for her future? She wasn't sure she was ready for the answer, but it didn't matter. The Duke had made his choice, and now she had to live with it. As the Duke stepped away from her, the room seemed to come back to life. The chatter resumed, but it wasn't the same. There was an edge to the whispers, an undercurrent of something darker. Victoria was no longer just a part of the background. She was at the center of the storm. She could feel the eyes of the court on her, the weight of their judgment, but she could also feel the Duke's gaze on her. He was still watching, still waiting for her to prove herself, to prove that she belonged in this world. But did she? The question lingered in her mind as the Duke turned away, his back now to her, his focus on the crowd. But Victoria knew this moment wasn't over. It had only just begun. The weight of Duke Darnley's decision pressed down on Victoria with each passing moment. The crowd around them buzzed with murmurs, whispers that clawed at the edges of her composure, but she refused to break. She stood next to him, still feeling the thrum of tension between them, as if the air itself were drawn tight, stretched to its breaking point. The ballroom had become a battlefield of power, and she was now a pawn in a game she hadn't chosen to play. The Duke, for all his calm, seemed to draw strength from the chaos he had created. His posture remained unyielding, the epitome of aristocratic control, while the room seemed to watch her, waiting for her to crack under the pressure. The touch of his hand on her lower back was a constant reminder of his control over her. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a marking, a declaration of ownership, and it held her in place. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, but with every step, the Duke's hand kept her steady, guiding her through the sea of nobles who now looked at her not with disdain, but with something more dangerous, curiosity. The tension between them had not dissipated, it only built. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered to hers, a silent challenge in his gaze. Victoria could feel the shift. Her position had changed, but so had the expectations. She was no longer the invisible woman in the corner of the room. She was now the one everyone was watching. The suffocating pressure of their gazes made her want to flee, but the Duke's hand kept her tethered to him. "Walk with me," he murmured, his voice low and steady, as though he commanded the very air they breathed. She took a step forward, and he followed, never letting go of the invisible thread that connected them. As they moved through the ballroom, she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The room had fallen into a tense silence, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. She could hear the delicate sound of her shoes on the marble floor, each step echoing in the cavernous space, amplifying the tension between them. He was the Duke, and she was the one he had chosen. She was a part of his world now, but did that mean she had any say in it? The question churned in her mind as they walked side by side, but the Duke didn't answer. His silence was as commanding as any speech. As they approached the grand staircase, the Duke stopped, turning to face her. The movement was so sudden, so precise, that it left her breathless. His eyes were fixed on her, his expression unreadable, as if he were studying her in a way that made her feel both seen and unseen. "You don't understand, do you?" he asked, his voice quiet but full of authority. Victoria froze, the words cutting through the tension like a blade. She had thought she understood, had thought she knew where she stood in this game. But now, in the face of his gaze, she felt like she was floundering in deep water, struggling to keep her head above the surface. "You think this is a choice, but it's not. You were never meant to be invisible, Victoria. You were meant to be here." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. She had been marked by his attention, not by choice but by destiny, by his choosing. And now, she was part of something much larger than herself. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't tell him that she didn't want this, that she hadn't asked for this. Because in a way, she had. She had longed for recognition, longed for something more than the quiet corners she had been relegated to. But now that she was here, standing beside the Duke, the truth hit her with the force of a thunderclap. She didn't know what this world demanded of her. The Duke stepped closer, his presence a towering force that filled the space between them. His hand reached out, his fingers brushing against her wrist with a casualness that was anything but indifferent. Victoria flinched, the touch sending a jolt through her. His eyes never left hers, studying her with a curiosity that unsettled her. "You are not who you think you are," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "Not anymore." The impact of his words landed like a punch to her chest. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked woman she had been. She had been thrust into a world of power, of influence, and the Duke had placed her at the very heart of it. But was she ready for it? Was she strong enough to play the game? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. "You're mine now," he said, his voice steady. But there was something in his tone that made her feel both terrified and exhilarated. It was the certainty in his words, the quiet authority that seemed to hold her in place. "And you will learn what that means, whether you're ready or not." His hand left her wrist, but the weight of his words lingered. As the Duke turned away, his back now to her, she felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. The world around her had shifted, and she was no longer just an observer. She was part of it now, part of his world. The tension in the room had not dissipated. It only grew stronger, more palpable, as if the air itself were charged with anticipation. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't turn back now. She had been marked by his touch, chosen by his will. And the game was only just beginning. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest as the Duke's hand settled once again on her arm, guiding her through the crowd. The tension between them was unbearable, a silent war of wills. Every step she took, every movement he made, sent ripples of power and uncertainty through the ballroom. The guests watched, their eyes flickering between the two of them, their whispers now louder, more biting. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but it was nothing compared to the pressure of the Duke's presence at her side. His hand, steady and firm on her arm, felt like a brand, marking her, reminding her that she had been chosen by him. The words from earlier echoed in her mind. "Asterisk, you belong here. You are mine now." Asterisk, but what did it mean? She wasn't sure she wanted to belong in this world. She wasn't sure if she could endure the weight of this power, of being at the Duke's side, in this gilded cage of wealth and status. The room seemed to close in on her, each breath a little harder to take. And yet, she couldn't move away. She was tethered to him, bound by something more than the physical touch of his hand. It was the knowledge that her life had changed, irrevocably, and there was no escape. As they walked, the crowd parted like the sea before them, but it wasn't reverence she saw in their eyes. It was something darker. Resentment, jealousy, fear. The nobles around them were no longer speaking in hushed tones. They were speaking openly, but their words were sharp, tinged with suspicion. "Who does she think she is?" she heard one woman murmur, her voice dripping with disdain. "A lowly nobody, yet she walks by his side as though she owns the place." Another voice, a man's, sneered, "She'll crumble under the pressure. She's not cut out for this world." The words stung, but Victoria refused to show it. She had been a shadow for so long that the light was blinding now. The Duke didn't flinch, didn't respond. He simply moved forward, his presence cutting through the whispers. He wasn't worried about the rumors, the judgment, or the looks. He was the Duke, and no one could take that from him. But Victoria felt it. Every whisper, every glance, they were all a reminder of how quickly everything could unravel. She had been thrust into the heart of this world, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the Duke's protection might not be enough to shield her from the storm. They reached the top of the grand staircase, and the Duke stopped. His hand left her arm, and the sudden absence of his touch felt like the loss of a lifeline. She wanted to speak, to ask him what this meant, but the words stuck in her throat. The crowd had followed them up the stairs, their eyes never leaving her. She felt the weight of their gaze like a physical force, but the Duke didn't look back. He was focused, his eyes ahead, as if he had already decided what came next. The moment felt suspended, like a breath held too long. And then, without a word, the Duke turned to face her, his gaze sharp and calculating. "You are mine now," he said, his voice low but firm. "But don't mistake this for a favor. This is not charity. You will prove yourself, or you will be discarded. It's your choice." His words hit her like a cold wave. She had been thrust into his world, but she wasn't a part of it yet. She wasn't anything to him but a challenge, a pawn to be moved on his chessboard. And that realization sent a chill through her. She had been marked by him, but what did that really mean? Was she ready for this game? Was she ready to step into the fire with him? "I don't need to explain myself to anyone," the Duke continued, his eyes flickering over the nobles gathered below. "You will stand beside me, and they will watch. They will learn that you belong here, just as I do." The finality of his words left no room for argument, no space for her to question him. His decision had been made, and she was the consequence. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, suffocating her. She had been invisible for so long, and now she was being forced into the spotlight. But was it worth it? The Duke's power was undeniable, but did she want to be a part of it? As the crowd looked on, she could feel their eyes on her, measuring her, calculating how long she would last in this gilded world. She wasn't sure she belonged here, but the Duke had already made that decision for her. She was in too deep to back out now. The Duke turned his back to her again, his eyes scanning the room as if he were the ruler of this domain, commanding everyone's attention with a single glance. Victoria stood frozen, her thoughts racing. She had no idea what the next step was, no idea how to navigate this treacherous game. But one thing was clear, she was no longer a shadow. She was now part of the Duke's world, whether she liked it or not. And the tension between them, between her place in this world and the power he held, was far from over. The tension in the ballroom was palpable, every movement sharp and deliberate as the Duke and Victoria stood at the center, the weight of the room's expectations pressing on them both. The Duke's hand never left her, a constant reminder of his control. His touch was firm, but the pressure in the air between them was growing heavier with each passing second. Victoria could feel the eyes of the room on her, some with admiration, others with envy, but most filled with disdain. She had become the object of their curiosity, their judgment, but the Duke was the only one who mattered now. He had claimed her, and that declaration was rippling through the fabric of the aristocratic world, shaking its very foundation. "You think this is a game?" The Duke's voice was quiet, but the venom in his words cut through the stillness like a blade. Victoria felt the sting of his tone, even though she had no intention of challenging him. She knew that her place beside him wasn't out of charity. It was power, cold and unyielding. She wanted to speak, to say something that might defuse the tension building between them, but she couldn't find her voice. Instead, she stood there, caught in the current of his influence, the pressure of his expectations weighing her down. His hand tightened slightly on her arm, a subtle command that she couldn't ignore. "You're a part of this now," he said, his voice a low murmur, but the intensity of it sent a shiver down her spine. "No longer a shadow. You're seen." The words hung in the air like a challenge. And the challenge was clear. Could she stand beside him, in this world, this life, without breaking under the weight of it all? The room was still, the silence growing more deafening with each passing moment. Victoria could hear her own breath, shallow and quick, as if her body itself was bracing for something she couldn't see. Her hand clenched into a fist at her side, the tension inside her reaching a breaking point. The Duke had forced her into this world, but now, it was up to her to decide if she could survive it. She was no longer invisible. The eyes of the room were locked on her, and for the first time in her life, she was the center of it all. But the question remained. Was she strong enough to hold her ground, to face the scrutiny, the power struggles, the weight of everything that came with being chosen by him? As if sensing her internal struggle, the Duke moved closer, his body barely touching hers. The heat between them was unmistakable, and yet it only made the distance between them feel more impossible to bridge. "You think you have a choice in this," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "But you don't. You are mine, and that means you will do whatever it takes to fit in." His words weren't a promise. They were an ultimatum. Victoria stood there, frozen, unsure whether to pull away or lean into the power he was offering. The tension in the air was so thick, it was almost suffocating. She was no longer the woman in the corner of the room, the one whose presence went unnoticed. Now, she was the one everyone was watching, waiting to see if she would crumble under the pressure or rise to meet it. The Duke didn't let go of her, didn't give her the space to breathe. His control was absolute, and in that moment, Victoria realized something that unsettled her deeply. She wasn't just a piece in his game. She was his game, and the rules had already been set. She was to play by them, or face the consequences. The room seemed to blur around them, the guests fading into the background as the Duke's presence filled every inch of the space. The whispers began again, but this time, they were louder, more biting. She could hear them, feel them in the air, surrounding her like a suffocating fog. "She'll never last," one voice whispered. "He'll tire of her soon enough," another added. But Duke Darnley didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't need to. He was the Duke, and his power was absolute. As they stood there, surrounded by the aristocracy, Victoria could feel her pulse quicken, the pressure building inside her chest. She had been chosen by him, but that didn't mean she had a place in this world. She didn't belong here. She was an outsider, and yet, she had been thrust into the heart of it all. The question was no longer whether she wanted to stay. It was whether she could survive this world, this life, with the Duke at her side. Could she navigate this delicate web of power, envy, and control without breaking? Could she learn to play the game on his terms, or would she be consumed by it? The Duke's hand left her arm, and for the briefest moment, she felt an emptiness, a sudden vulnerability that made her skin crawl. But before she could react, he stepped back, his eyes never leaving her. The room had gone silent once again. The Duke had shifted the power dynamic, but the real test was about to begin. Victoria was no longer just the woman in the background. She was at the center of it all, and the weight of that realization settled over her like a storm cloud, thick with tension and uncertainty. The game had begun, and she had no idea how it would end. The tension in the ballroom had reached its breaking point, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken threats. Duke Darnley's presence was like a storm, his every movement deliberate, every glance calculating. Victoria stood beside him, feeling the weight of his expectations pressed down on her, suffocating her. The room was alive with whispers, the murmurs of the nobles growing louder with each passing moment. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment, their curiosity. She had been thrust into the center of this world, but she wasn't sure she belonged here. Her heart raced, the pulse of the room syncing with the rapid beats of her own. The Duke's hand was firm on her arm, guiding her through the crowd, but she felt as though she were walking a tightrope, one misstep away from falling into chaos. He wasn't just the Duke of Dunmore. He was a man whose power could bend the world around him. And now, she was at his side, caught in a game she didn't fully understand. The whispers grew louder, more pointed, and she could feel the weight of the room's judgment pressing down on her. "She's out of her depth," a woman's voice hissed. "She'll break," another muttered. The tension in Victoria's chest tightened, her body caught between the need to shrink away and the urge to stand tall. But she couldn't escape the fact that every eye in the room was fixed on her. She had been chosen, but that didn't mean she had a place here. "Ignore them." The Duke's voice cut through her thoughts, low and commanding. His grip on her arm tightened slightly, his touch like iron. His words were not meant to reassure her, but to remind her of her place. She was his now, and there was no turning back. As they reached the center of the ballroom, everything seemed to freeze. The sound of the music faded, the chatter silenced. All that remained was the Duke and Victoria, standing at the heart of the room. His eyes locked with hers, dark and unreadable, and for a moment, she felt completely exposed. "You are mine," he said, his voice steady, unyielding. "And in this world, that means you belong here, with me. They'll watch. They'll wait. But they will never take what is mine." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket of cold iron. She had been chosen, but she hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked to be a part of this world, this power struggle. She had never wanted to be the center of their attention. She had never wanted to be the object of their envy. But now she was, and there was no escaping it. The Duke's hand slipped from her arm, but the power he wielded over her remained. The room, once full of murmurs and whispers, had fallen into a thick, suffocating silence. All eyes were on her, and for the first time, she understood the full weight of what the Duke had done. He hadn't just chosen her. He had made her the center of their world, and now, she had to prove she could survive it. "You think you can handle this?" The Duke's words cut through the silence, his voice like steel. Victoria didn't answer immediately. She wanted to scream that she wasn't ready for this, that she didn't belong here, but the words caught in her throat. She had been thrust into this world of power, of expectation, of constant observation. The weight of the room's judgment was unbearable, but she could feel it building inside her. A fire, something she didn't understand, something she couldn't control. She was no longer just the woman standing in the corner, unnoticed. She was at the heart of this world now, and the Duke had made it clear that she would either sink or swim. His eyes never left her, studying her, waiting for her to break. The pressure of it was unbearable, but she refused to crumble. The Duke took a step closer, his body moving toward hers like a predator closing in on its prey. His presence was overwhelming, and the room seemed to shrink around them. The air between them crackled with an energy that neither of them could deny. "You will prove yourself," he said, his voice low, but the command in it was undeniable. Not to them, to me. The power dynamic had shifted once more, but this time, it wasn't just the Duke who held the reins. Victoria could feel it. The fire inside her, the spark of defiance she hadn't realized was there. She wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was the one who would decide how this story ended. The room held its breath, waiting, watching. The Duke stood before her, the embodiment of power and control, but Victoria could feel the shift. She wasn't the weak woman in the background anymore. She wasn't the one to be discarded. She was his equal in this moment. And as the tension in the room reached its peak, she made her decision. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to crumble. But she didn't. She stood tall, her heart pounding, her breath steady. She was no longer afraid. She was no longer the woman in the shadows. She was ready to step into the light. The Duke's eyes flickered with something, a shift, a recognition. But he said nothing. He didn't need to. The power between them had shifted once more, and for the first time, Victoria felt like she was in control. The ballroom, the nobles, the whispers, they were all background noise now. She had taken her place in this world, and no one, least of all the Duke, would take that from her. The ballroom had fallen into a deep silence, the weight of Duke Darnley's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Victoria stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest, as the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The power dynamic had shifted once again, but this time it wasn't just the Duke who commanded the room. It was her. His gaze, sharp and unyielding, flicked to hers, as though testing her resolve. But something was different this time. The fire that had been simmering inside her since she had been thrust into this world was no longer a quiet ember. It was an inferno, burning with the promise of something she couldn't quite name, but knew would change everything. Do you understand? The Duke's voice was low, but it held an edge now, a crack of something deeper beneath the surface. His hand reached for her arm, but this time, Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't shrink away. She met his gaze, her own eyes steady and determined. "Yes," she said, the word barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of her decision. The decision to stop being a pawn in his game, to stop being the shadow in the corner. The room seemed to hold its breath. The Duke's grip on her arm tightened for a fraction of a second, as if he were testing her, as if he were trying to see if she would break under the pressure. But Victoria didn't move. She stood firm, the tension in the air between them so thick it could be cut with a knife. And then, without warning, the world around them seemed to shift. The quiet murmur of the guests faded into the background, as if the ballroom had become a distant memory. There was only the two of them, caught in the eye of a storm neither of them could control. "You think you're ready for this," the Duke said, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "But you're not. You have no idea what you've stepped into." Victoria took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest, and she reached out, her hand brushing against his. The room seemed to freeze in that moment, the air around them crackling with electricity. She could feel the power surging between them, the pull of it almost magnetic. "I don't need you to tell me what I can and cannot do," she said, her voice steady. But the words were sharp, cutting through the tension between them like a blade. The Duke's eyes flickered, a flash of something she couldn't read passing through them. For the first time since they had met, she saw something resembling surprise. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that familiar mask of control. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, his voice still calm. But there was a trace of something else there now. Something darker, something more dangerous. Victoria could feel the shift in the room, the air thickening around them. It wasn't just the Duke who was powerful anymore, it was her. She had felt the power inside her from the moment he had chosen her. But now, she was starting to understand what it meant. She wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was the queen, and it was time to take control of the board. As the Duke moved closer, his presence overwhelming, Victoria stood her ground. "You've underestimated me," she said, her voice cold, but her words were sharp, like a blade ready to strike. The Duke's gaze softened, just for a moment, and in that moment, Victoria saw the flicker of something she hadn't expected, respect. But it was quickly replaced by something else, something darker, something more dangerous. "Do you think you can control this world?" the Duke asked, his voice suddenly harder, colder. "You think you can change the rules? You think you can challenge me?" Victoria took a deep breath, the weight of his words pressing down on her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. The tension between them had reached its peak, and in that moment, Victoria felt something shift inside her. The power she had felt earlier, that pull, that fire, it was hers. The Duke had given her a place in this world, but now it was her turn to take control. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the charge of the moment. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into this ballroom. She wasn't the woman who had been dismissed, forgotten, ignored. She was someone else now, someone who could stand beside the Duke, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. The Duke didn't flinch as she stepped closer, but Victoria could see the shift in his eyes. The power between them was shifting again, and this time, it wasn't just his. "I'm not afraid of you," Victoria said, her voice steady, but there was a spark in it now, a fire that burned brighter than ever before. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and for the first time, he didn't seem to know what to do. The room was frozen, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. And then, with a single movement, he stepped back, his gaze never leaving hers. The power had shifted, the roles had reversed, and in that moment, Victoria knew she was no longer a pawn in the Duke's game. She was the one calling the shots, and the game was just beginning. The room seemed to close in around Victoria as the weight of the truth hit her. The Duke's words had cut through the air like a blade, and everything she had believed, everything she had thought about her place in this world, was unraveling before her eyes. The power between them had shifted so dramatically that she could hardly breathe. He had chosen her, yes, but now she realized the cost of that choice. She wasn't just a part of his world, she was the focal point of it, the center of the storm. And the realization hit her with a force so overwhelming it left her frozen in place. Do you understand now? The Duke's voice was low, dangerous, as he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. His presence, once a steady comfort, now felt like a weight she couldn't escape. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, reverberated in her chest, shaking her resolve. Victoria couldn't move. She stood there, paralyzed by the truth of it all. The truth she hadn't been ready to see. She had been a pawn in a game, one she thought she could control, but now she realized she was nothing more than a piece to be moved around on his board. I chose you, the Duke said, his voice cutting through the silence between them. Because you were never supposed to be hidden in the shadows. You were meant to be seen. And now you are. His words stung, a cruel reminder of how little control she had over her own life. She had thought she could change things, that somehow she could make her mark in this world. But she was wrong. The Duke had made the rules, and she was just following them. You will take your place beside me, he continued, his tone colder now, more commanding. And you will prove that you belong here, in this world, at my side. Whether you like it or not. Victoria could feel the tension building inside her, a storm raging just beneath the surface. She wanted to scream, to push him away, to take control of her own destiny, but she was caught in a trap of her own making. The realization that she had been manipulated, that she had been used to play a game she didn't even understand, left her breathless. She had become a pawn in the Duke's power play, and she hated him for it. But what could she do? The room was watching. The nobles, the men and women who had once ignored her, now watched with hungry eyes, waiting for her to crack, waiting for her to show weakness. And they wouldn't get that from her. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. The Duke was right about one thing. She wasn't the woman she used to be. She wasn't the quiet, invisible woman who stood in the corner. She was something else now, something stronger, something more dangerous. And for the first time, Victoria could feel the shift in the air, the power she had been given, the power she had taken. She wasn't going to let him control her any longer. With a swift movement, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The Duke's eyes flickered with surprise, but he didn't flinch. He was used to being in control, to having the power to bend others to his will. But in that moment, Victoria realized something she hadn't fully understood before. She was no longer just a part of his world. She had become a force to be reckoned with. She stood before him, her chest heaving with the weight of her emotions. I don't need you to tell me where I belong, she said, her voice trembling with the strength of her conviction. I know exactly where I belong. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the Duke didn't respond immediately. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. For a split second, Victoria thought he might strike her down, that he would punish her for daring to speak back. But then, something shifted. His eyes softened, just slightly, and for the first time, she saw something in him that she hadn't seen before, respect. It was fleeting, gone in an instant, but it was there. The Duke stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, and Victoria could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the pressure of their expectations. But she didn't falter. She stood tall, her back straight, her eyes locked onto his. You've underestimated me, she said, her voice steady now, the fire inside her burning brighter than ever before. And I'm not afraid of you. The Duke's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. But it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of recognition. He knew, just as she did, that everything had changed. The power had shifted once again, and this time, it wasn't just his to wield. Victoria had taken her place in this world, and there was no going back. The room was silent, but the energy between them was electric. She had claimed her power, and she had done it on her own terms. No longer a shadow in his world, she had stepped into the light. And with that, everything changed. The Duke's smile faded, his expression hardening once more. Very well, he said, his voice cold, the game now. Fully set in motion. But remember, you are not as free as you think. The challenge in his words was clear, and Victoria knew that the game was far from over. But this time, she was ready for it. She wasn't going to be the one pushed aside anymore. She was going to fight, and the Duke would learn that she was not someone to be underestimated. Not anymore. The room felt heavy with anticipation as Duke Darnley stood before Victoria, their gazes locked, the air between them charged with the weight of their shared history. The ballroom, once a space filled with laughter and music, now felt like a battlefield, silent, still, yet brimming with unspoken words. Victoria could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but this time, there was no fear. There was only resolve. She had been chosen by him, yes. She had been pushed, tested, bent by the weight of his expectations, but she was no longer the woman who stood in the shadow of his power. She was not a pawn to be moved at will. She was something else now, something he had underestimated. The Duke's eyes flickered with a mixture of pride and something more dangerous, possessiveness, a need to control that was now slipping from his grasp. But Victoria wasn't ready to relinquish the power she had fought for. She had fought to take her place, and now, standing before him, she realized she had finally stepped into her own. The Duke's voice cut through the silence. "You think you've won," he said, his words sharp, but beneath them, there was a hint of uncertainty, of something deeper that Victoria couldn't quite place. "But you're mistaken. You're still in my world, Victoria." His words stung, but they no longer held the same weight they once did. She could feel the shift in the room. The power that had once been his to command now hummed in the air around them, no longer so one-sided. She had claimed a piece of it, and that was enough to change everything. Without a word, the Duke took a step closer, closing the space between them, his presence overwhelming. His hand reached for her, but this time, Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't move back. Instead, she stepped forward, meeting him halfway. "I don't need you to control me," she said, her voice steady, the fire in her eyes burning brighter than ever. "I am not your possession, and I will no longer be your pawn." The Duke paused, his expression hardening, but there was something else behind his eyes, a flicker of respect, perhaps, or maybe something darker, something that recognized her power. The tension in the room thickened, but it was different now. It was no longer about submission. It was about equality. She was no longer beneath him, nor was she an accessory in his life. She had earned her place by his side, not because he had given it to her, but because she had taken it. The guests around them remained silent, watching the exchange, unsure of what to make of the shifting power dynamic. But the Duke didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed solely on Victoria. For the first time, she saw him truly see her, not as a prize to be won, not as a shadow to be controlled, but as someone who stood on her own, someone who had fought for her place in this world. She felt it in the air between them, the unspoken recognition that they were no longer enemies, but partners. And that realization hit her harder than anything else. She had spent so long wondering if she was strong enough to stand beside him, but now she knew. She was strong enough, stronger than she had ever realized. As the Duke reached out to touch her, Victoria felt a rush of emotion. It wasn't fear or anger or resentment. It was a quiet power, the kind that came from knowing who you were and no longer needing anyone's approval to be who you were meant to be. His fingers brushed her arm, but this time, it wasn't a claim. It was an acknowledgement. She was no longer beneath him. They were equals now. The shift in the room was palpable, the tension finally beginning to ease. The guests had begun to murmur among themselves, their voices rising in a mixture of awe and confusion. Victoria could hear them now, their whispers no longer filled with disdain, but with curiosity. "She's changed," someone whispered. "She's not the same girl we saw earlier." Another voice, this time a man's, said, "She's stronger than we thought." But Victoria didn't care what they thought anymore. The Duke's power had always been undeniable, but so was hers. She had earned her place in his world, and now she was ready to take her place in the world of the aristocracy. The moment felt suspended, as though the ballroom itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. And then, in one fluid motion, the Duke turned away from her, his back now to her, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. But Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't need to prove anything to him anymore. The moment had passed. The power had shifted, and she had come out on top. The Duke's world, once so secure in its hierarchy, had shifted. And now, the game had changed. The tension had not fully dissipated, but it had been transformed. The power no longer resided solely in the Duke's hands. It was shared now. And in that moment, Victoria knew that she had claimed her place, not just by the Duke's side, but in the world she had always dreamed of. The tension lingered in the air, a reminder that their story was far from over. But Victoria stood there, unshaken, ready for whatever came next. She had proven herself, and no one could take that away from her. The ballroom had fallen into an eerie silence as the Duke and Victoria stood at the center, the weight of their shared history settling between them like a thick fog. The power between them had shifted irrevocably. There was no longer any doubt. Victoria had proven herself. She was no longer the woman dismissed and discarded by those around her. She had claimed her place by the Duke's side, not as a shadow, but as an equal. The Duke's eyes, once filled with cold calculation, now softened just slightly, a rare flicker of respect that he had never shown before. But even that fleeting moment was enough to solidify the change in their dynamic. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words. For a long moment, neither moved, as if the world around them had stopped. The guests, once whispering and judging, were now silent, watching the two of them with wide eyes, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Victoria stood tall, her heart still racing, but she didn't look away. The Duke's power had always been undeniable, but now she knew she held the key to her own future. She had taken control of her own destiny. "You've done well," the Duke said, his voice low and steady, but there was something different in the way he spoke. He wasn't the man who had once dismissed her as a mere afterthought. He wasn't the man who had used her to play his game. He was a man who had seen her strength, her fire, and in that moment, Victoria knew that their roles had been irrevocably changed. He was no longer the only one in control. She was too. "I've proven more than you expected," Victoria replied, her voice steady, the fire in her eyes burning brighter than ever before. The Duke's lips twitched, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming as if he was acknowledging the truth of her words. For a moment, the world seemed to slow, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. But then, as if to break the tension, the Duke stepped back slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've proven yourself worthy," he said, the finality of his words carrying the weight of his respect. Victoria held her ground, her chest swelling with pride. She had fought for this moment. She had fought to claim her place, not as a passive observer in the Duke's world, but as a force in her own right. The room around them began to stir, the silence finally breaking as the nobles resumed their whispers, though this time, they were not filled with disdain. They were filled with awe, a recognition of her strength, her ability to stand toe-to-toe with the Duke and emerge not only unbroken but victorious. Victoria felt the weight of their gazes, but it didn't bother her. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had